Viktor Frankl survived 3 years in Nazi concentration camps. He emerged with a chilling conclusion that suffering is an ineradicable part of life, as certain as death itself. If he is right, and if pain truly is a universal human fate, then why exactly is it so unevenly distributed? Why do specific groups of people experience such staggering intensity while others do not? To find the answer, the Global Flourishing Study surveyed more than 200,000 people across 22 different countries. This research team bypassed standard metrics like annual income or physical disease. They set out to measure the subjective experience of suffering as a primary data point. This effort establishes suffering as a quantifiable epidemiology. It provides a map of human misery that we can finally analyze with the same rigor we apply to a physical virus. Mapping suffering requires a definition that survives scientific scrutiny. It has to be more than a vague feeling of sadness. In this context, suffering is defined by the occurrent desire that the state not be occurring. You aren't just experiencing a negative state, you are actively fighting against the very fact that it exists. That specific internal friction is what separates suffering from simple physical pain. The study also proved that this state is distinct from depression. The two often overlap, but the data shows they operate as independent conditions with different drivers. This diagram shows the clear boundaries established by the researchers. Isolating these differences allows us to track suffering like a pathogen, identifying where it thrives and how it spreads through a population. By treating suffering as its own measurable phenomenon, we can start to see its actual footprint across the globe. Once the data came in, the disparities between nations were immense. This map shows 22 national surveys. Suffering rates range from 24% in Poland to 60% in Türkiye. This gap reflects nested societal layers, like government policy and culture. However, cultural norms can obscure truth. In South Africa, suffering scored low despite high poverty and conflict because in highly cohesive societies, individuals repress distress to preserve community. While a nation's culture sets the baseline, the geography doesn't tell the whole story. To see who is most at risk, we have to look closer at the individuals themselves. When you look past national borders, the same 3 demographic markers predict suffering in almost every country on Earth. This chart shows how specific life changes correlate with spikes in reported suffering. The first major risk factor is spouse separation, a catastrophic loss of interpersonal resources. The other peaks appear among the unemployed and those with 8 years of education or less. This follows conservation of resources theory. We see suffering reach its highest intensity during the severe privation of a valued resource, whether that is a stable family, a job, or an education. Human misery isn't a random strike of fate. It is a predictable outcome of the systematic loss of personal and social leverage. We can return to Frankl's premise with a new perspective. Suffering is part of the human condition, but its concentration within specific demographic groups is a choice. This data gives policymakers a roadmap. They can stop viewing suffering as a private mystery and start targeting the root vulnerabilities that cause it to cluster in these populations. We can design structural solutions that function like preventative medicine, vocational training, adult education, and targeted social support for the separated. Measuring suffering identifies it as a collective health crisis. It turns a silent, private burden into a public challenge that can be solved with evidence and policy.